It's 10 wins out of 10 for Bayern Munich, and Harry Kane is breaking records again. So could they be the best team in Europe? Well, to get into it on today's show, brought to you by BOYLE Sports, we've got Thom Harris making his debut. We've also got John Mackenzie. John, 10 wins out of 10. Brilliant stat. Great start to the season for Vincent Kompany and Bayern Munich. What have we learned from these early stages of the season so far?
Yeah, well, we've got the 10 results up here, and I think what a lot of people might do is start looking through some of the names on this list and say, you know, we've got Wien Wiesbaden here and Pathos and Hamburg, who recently promoted. How much can we really tell from what we have seen from Bayern Munich so far? I think there's a few caveats that we should say there. There is a game against Chelsea in that mix, so you know we're already talking about an elite side in the European stage, but also Stuttgart and Leipzig, third and fourth in the Bundesliga at the moment, and then Bayern are about to play Dortmund, who are the second place team in the Bundesliga, but this does suggest that against the teams in the Bundesliga, Bayern are being very comfortable. 6-0 win against RB Leipzig on the opening day is indicative of that. And so the big question from this is, most of these teams you would expect Bayern to beat comfortably. So how do we start working out what level they're actually at, given that they've got, obviously 10 wins out of 10 is still impressive either way. And I think that's what we're going to try and do today, try and work out what level we actually think Bayern are at.
Yeah, I mean, Thom, you try and break this down, because this got to be quite hard to measure.
Yeah, absolutely. As John's said there's no real kind of scale factor in terms of saying that this set of results is X times more impressive than this set of results in a different league. But we can have a go. We've got Opta's power rankings here on the board, which is kind of like an ELO ranking system where they use results. They continuously update the rankings based on which teams are beating who. You get positive points for wins, negative points for defeats. And they also bake in a lot of stats here in terms of, you know, possession, kind of goal difference, all these kind of things. And it does give us, you know, even though I don't want to kind of say we should use a single number to rate a team, it does give us a broad overview of the kind of quality of teams within the different leagues. And I think what we can see here on this chart, this is a box and whisker chart, which you might remember from GCSE maths. There's the lowest ranked teams right at the bottom, the highest ranked teams right at the top, and then there's this kind of interquartile range. And in the middle, there is the median. So that's kind of the average quality of those leagues.
That's the gold line in the middle there that we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly right. And we can see that gold line for the Premier League is ahead of basically every other league by quite a distance, which suggests that, yeah, Premier League teams are facing higher quality sides week in, week out. We can also see that the Bundesliga, obviously it's close, but is, according to Opta's power rankings, the weakest league in terms of team quality. And we can also see that, you know, Bayern Munich, along with PSG, who we'll probably get onto later, are the outliers. And the quality of their team, according to Opta's rankings, is a lot higher than the mean quality in their division. So going back to those results we were speaking about, yeah, it's difficult to measure how impressive they are, because at least the data suggests that they should be beating those teams, and they have been doing.
Okay, let's sort of illustrate it then. How does that sort of dominance of Bayern translate onto the actual pitch?
Yeah, I mean, obviously having high quality players who, you know, technically it means you can control the game with the ball, you can pass the ball, you can maintain possession. But I also think there is a lot of these players who are playing for Bayern Munich are kind of faster, stronger, more athletic. And I think that is resulting in kind of more team-wide collective dominance of games. I think we can see that in this visualization we have coming up about Bayern Munich's their defensive metrics. We have along the bottom, we have share of opposition sequences ending in the final third. So it sounds a little bit scary, but it's basically saying the lower percentage here, which is towards the right where we can see Bayern Munich are, it means that a lower percentage of opposition passing moves are ending in their defensive third. So it means that essentially they're keeping passing moves from the opposition away from their goal, which is clearly a good thing. And then on the y-axis, we have, again, it's negative, so the higher up you are, the less XG you're conceding. It's cumulative and expected goals conceded from those same sequences. So we can see there that Bayern Munich are clear outliers. They're able to control the game. They're able to keep their opposition away from them, along with teams like Arsenal, who are also quite high up in this visualization as well. But I think, interestingly, if we move on to the next graphic, we can zoom in on transitions and on fast breaks, because I think there has been a bit of a trend in European football over the last 2 seasons or so that teams who like to play with possession and dominate the ball, like Barcelona, like Manchester City in particular last season, are getting hit by organised teams Pep Guardiola said it himself, the likes of Bournemouth, the likes of Brighton, who are hitting hard on the counter-attack when they win the ball in transition. And we can see, even with Arsenal, who are still a very solid defensive side, there is a general upward trend in terms of how many chances they are conceding to fast breaks. But with Bayern Munich, it stayed very, very steady and even dropped to 0.01 per game. Obviously, it's a low sample size this season, but that is quite telling, especially in a division like the Bundesliga. We've spoken about the lower quality, but it's famous for counter-attacks, it's famous for transitions and fast attacking play. They're still able to keep that under control, and I think that's a really kind of telling statistic and part of the reason why they have been able to be so dominant.
Yeah, that conversation around counter-attacks is interesting, especially around the context of modern football. But when it comes to Bayern Munich, why on earth are they not facing that many counter-attacks in the Bundesliga?
Well, I think, as Thom pointed out, a lot of this hangs on like how much possession you're having. A lot of the elite teams over the last decade or so, in the wake of Pep Guardiola, have tried to hold possession as much as possible, but hold it as high up the pitch as possible because it keeps it away from their goal. But what we're starting to see now is that teams have routes to goal if you lose the ball in those situations. I think what we're starting to see from Bayern is maybe a recognition of this fact, and as a result, they're not necessarily trying to hold the ball as long as they were before, so they're happier to sort of inject a little bit of more direction into their attacks at times, knowing that they have the defensive ability to stop those from becoming too much of a problem. So if we look at this viz here, we can see this is Bayern Munich's possession over the last few seasons. We can see the 24-25 season, which is when Kompany comes in. That jumps right up. That's what you would expect because Kompany is from that tradition of managers. Pep Guardiola was his coach for so long, as we all remember. But what's interesting this season is we see that number dropping right off. Now, obviously, this is still very high possession, right? It's still over 60%. So they are still wanting to be able to retain as much of the ball as possible. They still want to force opponents deep as and when they can. But I think what we're starting to see is them injecting other ways of being able to possess the ball, which allows them to actually recycle possession in those situations where they are maybe worried that it could result in transitions. The less of the ball you have, the less likely you are to give up transitions. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. But another area where we can quantify this is by looking at field tilt. Now, field tilt is an interesting metric.
I was hoping you'd explain it, mate. I know, but just let the people know. Come on.
Field tilt is a ratio. So what we're looking at is both teams at the same time. We're looking at how many touches, actions, passes they have in the final third compared to one another. So in this instance, 75%. If a team has 75% field tilt, it means they have 3 times as much actions in their final third as the other team. So a team who's dominating high up the pitch is going to have high field tilt. And what we can see again from this data is that when Kompany comes in, 24-25, that jumps right up. So again, high territorial dominance, high possession of the ball. But interestingly enough, this season we can see that dropping off as well, which suggests, again, that Bayern aren't wanting to possess the ball in quite the same way that elite teams have in the past. Maybe what they're trying to do is hold the ball in other areas as well. And I think this is actually having an impact on their defensive side, though. We talked a lot about the in-possession side, because they have less of the ball. They are happy to go more direct. Yes, that's going to introduce other problems, but it also solves the problem a little bit of these transitions where you commit so many players so high that you get hurt in response. We should also talk a little bit about the more general out of possession approach that Bayern have, because since Kompany's come in, they've actually taken a fairly novel approach to the defensive side of the game, because what they've done under Kompany is they've been very happy to, in lots of games, go man-to-man across the field, which is the modern approach to out of possession. They maybe do it slightly more aggressively than anyone else. And I think this works in the Bundesliga, because when you're going man-to-man out of possession, what you're doing is you're just making a series of these one-to-one matchups all over the pitch, right? And that works out really nicely when you have players who are just, the talent level is higher than the opponents they're playing against, because more often than not they're going to come out on top in these 1v1 battles all over the pitch. That's all well and good in the Bundesliga. It's going to be more interesting to see what happens in the Champions League when suddenly the quality mismatch of those 1v1 battles evens out much more as well. So obviously I don't think that Bayern are always going to go 1v1 against opponents when they're coming up against some of the better teams. But I think this is just like a really simple way of being able to keep your opponents quiet in the Bundesliga without having to have a huge I guess intellectual load from like a complex out of possession system. It means that you can then focus on working on your in possession game as well. So I think that's worth keeping an eye on as we go forward, because it will work in the Bundesliga. Will it work as well in the Champions League? We have to wait and see.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting to know whether the player profile they have allows that to be more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly off the ball, I think it's really noticeable now that a lot of Bayern Munich's, particularly in midfield, they're very physical, they're very athletic. Their centre-backs as well, we'll see Jonathan Tah and Upamecano can both step up and kind of retain that high line and be very, very solid in that kind of slightly dangerous position. But I think, Pavlovic is someone to look at because he's still only 21 years old. He's come through the academy, but he is, he's ranking very highly in the Bundesliga. Obviously, he plays for Bayern Munich, there's that caveat, but 95-ish passes per game, which is a lot. He's a tempo setter. He's able to move the ball into the final third, which is exactly what you need for these kind of possession dominant sides, but he's also very good off the ball. And I think this scatter plot will help to illustrate that. We have true tackles, which is a kind of amalgamation of tackles won, tackles lost, and fouls committed when you're attempting a tackle. So it's kind of a more kind of illustrative of how often a player looks to stick a foot in and try to win the ball. And we can see on the y-axis the players at the top here, like Gavi, Eduardo Camavinga, Elliot Anderson, players who make a lot of tackles, try to win the ball back often. On the x-axis, we've got players like Nico O'Reilly, Jude Bellingham, making fewer tackles, but they are very effective when they go to win that ball. And what we can see is Pavlovic in this group of players who do it both. And it's really important for for that man-to-man system that John was talking about, that your midfielders, you can rely on them to win these duels, to win these one-on-ones. And I think what's interesting is that Thom as well, he's not played too much for Bayern Munich so far. This season, he's only 20 years old. They bought it from Hoffenheim last season. But I think it's interesting that they're targeting another player like Pavlovic who can hold his own in these kind of duels off the ball. As we can see, he's in that group as well. So we've got an example here from a recent game against Augsburg. We can see their back four is in a bit of a weird shape because they are in the attack. Olise has drifted out to the left-hand side, but we can see the high line there kind of looking to maintain. We can also see Pavlovic and Stanisic, who's another player who we've not mentioned, but he has that athletic ability and is able to make these big tackles. The ball goes astray, but we can see how quickly Pavlovic here is in the middle. In the next couple of seconds, he's made up that ground, he's made this tackle, and he's kind of stopped a break at source. He doesn't cleanly win possession, it bounces back to an Augsburg player who instantly tries to play it over the top of a high line. But then we've got Stanisic who makes that lung-busting kind of recovery run to win the ball and snuff out the counter-attack at source. So I think that's a good example of, again, having these advantages in the 1v1 duels, but also having this, athleticism, physicality. It just means that Bayern Munich can control these kind of more chaotic moments of the game.
Brilliant. I mean, we've gone this far. We haven't even spoken about Harry Kane yet. I mean, we talk about individual players. He has scored 20 goals in all competitions so far this season. And I actually caught up with Seb Stafford Blur in the recent episode of the Athletic FC podcast to talk about the man. Here's what he had to say.
I think where we are now, there's definitely been an evolution in his game. And Bayern fans have seen that the deeper Kane plays in many ways, because he's able to, as you mentioned, because he's able to kind of balance it with, prolific return in front of goal. He's able to allow the team to do interesting things, particularly with, at the moment, Jamal Musiala injured until probably January. The team is without a central-based playmaker. And you're seeing Kane doing all kinds of things. You're seeing him pick up possession directly from his goalkeeper between the centre halves, which is, there are England fans whose heads would explode if they saw that happen on international duty. But it works, and you see also the effect on other players. You see his combinations with Michael Olise, who's developed into an outright star in German football since he moved from Crystal Palace. Serge Gnabry's career has been rejuvenated. He's been playing better than he has been in years, really. Luis Diaz has hit the ground running. He's been a tremendous addition. And a lot of it can be traced back to what Kane's able to do. Like, we mentioned right at the beginning of this podcast about we went back to Euro 96. Now, that's kind of back in the sort of fabled time of Shearer and Sheringham, right? Kane's kind of both. Kane's both of those players really in the same body. And I think as he's got older, and Rob made a really great point, what's the point in him being that kind of line-breaking player if he hasn't got the pace to do it and the players better suited to those roles? And that penny started to drop in Germany about 18 months ago, to the point where there's a recognition that he'll never quite represent what Robert Lewandowski did at Bayern because of the tonnage of what Lewandowski was able to win. I think there's an acceptance that Kane is a much broader player and a much better player.
Better than Lewandowski. I mean, it's high praise, but you know what Something we actually spoke about on the pod was actually something a lot of people don't rate him for, is his ability to also create goals as well, sits a little deeper. This is something that's been really fascinating. Is that how you see it at Munich as well?
Yeah, and I think it ties into what we were talking about before with the possession stats that we showed, which was we're actually seeing a Bayern Munich who are happy to have less of the ball slightly. And in part that's because they're wanting to go more direct. And I think what that looks like in practice is that they're actually finding different ways of accessing space. When you have players like Harry Kane, he's a great box presence. He will score those headed goals. He will be able to create separation from defenders and get shots away. But I think what we're starting to see now is the Kompany and his coaching staff finding some of the other areas where Kane has strengths and using them to actually generate other kinds of chances, maybe more dangerous chances. So what we're going to think about with Kane, I think, is how do you access and manipulate space when you have a player like Harry Kane? And fortunately, Harry Kane has given us some answers to that question. So this is a couple of quotes we got from Kane. So he's talking about the relationship that him and Serge Gnabry in particular have formed, also Nico Jackson. But he's saying that this relationship, or these relationships, allow me to just be a little bit deeper and use my qualities in that sense of turning and playing it forward and playing it out wide and then arriving in the box a little bit later. So he's talking about, rather than having the striker in the box, the striker dictating play from deeper and then arriving later on. And he says this also helps because sometimes when you're playing up there as a 9, it's easy to be marked out of the game almost. Even my goal today, arriving a little bit late, I finished it off. So what we're saying here is that not that Bayern are trying to get rid of the way they were playing previously, they're actually trying to augment it with other approaches as well. And we can see that in the touch maps of Harry Kane in certain games, because in some games he is playing that more box presence role. So we've got games against Leipzig here where you can see plenty of box actions, the game against Bremen as well. But there are some games, we've got the Augsburg game here and also the Frankfurt game, where you can see it's clear that Kane is doing most of his work deeper on the field, and this is opening space to be accessed by his teammates in other ways. So I wanted to give a bit more of a clear example of this. So this is the game against Chelsea in the Champions League, and I've got Kane and Gnabry highlighted here. So Kane's the striker, Gnabry's the number 10. Okay. And what we're already seeing in this situation, this is Bayern in a build-up phase, they're going to try and create space in that back line and manipulate it. So here we can see Gnabry dropping deeper, pulling his centre-back with him. That opens out a space in the back line, which Kane is already just looking for that. So if we fast forward it on, what we can see is Gnabry much deeper in the field, and here's Tosin Adarabioyo, who's marking him, and you can see he's pulled right out of that space to follow him. And we're talking about Gnabry receiving the ball off the goalkeeper if he wants to. But what's really interesting about this is the way that it opens out space for Bayern. Because if we look here, I've drawn the two lines on, so this is roughly the back line and then the midfield line. Here's Harry Kane, the other forward. So look how far apart the two forwards are, incredible amount of space. The player who's now marking Harry Kane, because Tosin has gone forward, is Moises Caicedo. Moises Caicedo would normally be in this space. So what you're doing then is you're opening out space in between the lines of the midfield and the defence, which I think are much more dangerous. These are the spaces where, when Kane is talking about arriving from deep, these are the spaces that they're looking for. So we can already see that by manipulating the forwards in this way, they are trying to create these kind of conditions. In this instance, they actually do try and build up from deep. Again, I've highlighted Kane here because what we see here is you've got Tosin having to drop deep now, and Caicedo is with him as well. So, and we've got this, the back line is now all over the place. So again, you're creating those disturbances in the opposition structure. But Bayern actually force the opponents deep into their own third, and they make their block really small, right? So this is the compaction of space that we talked about. And I think in the past, what we would expect from a team like Bayern is for them to try and keep their opponents in this situation. And you would hope, as a team with the quality of players like Bayern have, that they would eventually be able to generate some kind of chance from this. But actually in this instance, what's really interesting is what we were talking about before with the possession. Rather than possessing the ball high up, rather than getting really high field tilt, they're quite happy to recycle the ball right back. Actually, Kimmich here plays the ball back to the goalkeeper. So the ball, they recycle the ball right the way back down the field, having achieved what most elite sides you would think would want to. And already what this shows is just how much space now is opening back out into that block, where it was quite hard for them to actually access space inside the block. Now it's become much easier for them to do that. And again, what's really interesting here is when the ball goes to Neuer, he then plays it out to the centre-back, and we've got Kane and Gnabry both dropping deep. Again, you've got these spaces opening out. Who did the back line mark? They're just standing there covering space. And I think we get into this situation now where Here's Kane receiving the ball deeper that we're talking about. This is the space that we're talking about them opening out. So your back line sort of not really knowing what to do. Cucurella is pinned by Olise over here. This is really, really accessible space when you can then move the ball at speed. You trigger a sort of a bit more of a direct attack. Olise is in plenty of space. Kane can just find him with the pass. And then we have these sorts of abilities now for Bayern to be able to hit these spaces at speed more directly. Here's Konrad Laimer dropping in from fullback. So he's a player arriving from deeper, getting into that space, and then he's able to enter the box relatively unpressured here. That's a very different way to, I think, what you would expect elite teams to be doing over the last 10 years. But as you can see, it's a really good way of generating dangerous chances as well. So using Harry Kane in this way, I think, is really interesting. Seb mentioned that Musiala isn't around anymore. Kane can do that, but by dropping him deep rather than the 10, what you're actually doing then is opening out that space in the back line. Either the centre-backs step up, in which case you've got space in behind, which the wingers can access. Either they drop off, and then you've got players like Pavlovic or Laimer running in from deeper areas, receiving that, and then attacking at speed. So yeah, it's really exciting. The word that I would use to describe this is tactical diversity. As we said, they're not trying to get rid of the things they were doing before well. They're actually trying to balance them off with other ways of approaching things. And I think that's the world we live in now. The tactical landscape that we live in rewards teams who can switch their approaches, can attack in different ways. It's going to mean that you have lots of different approaches to play lots of different opponents, and that is really important in the Champions League. So the reason why I'm quite confident about Bayern going deep in the Champions League this season is because I think they are much better suited to have tactical solutions that they didn't have in previous seasons. And I think as a result of that, the Champions League is a knockout tournament. Even the favourites will have 1 in 4 chance of winning. But I think all you can do is get yourself into that situation where you have the tactical diversity to cause as many problems for your opponents as possible. And I think that's exactly where Bayern are at.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Bayern and I'm thinking of players like Olise, and you've also got Luis Diaz on the other side. But who else is really helping this system when it comes to Harry Kane?
Obviously, we're talking about that space being opened up and players attacking it late. And we saw it in the example that John used with Konrad Laimer arriving into that space with a deep run and getting into the box. I think he's been really, really important, a kind of an unsung hero of this kind of Bayern Munich start to the season. I think he's traditionally a midfielder, but he's been moved into a more of a right-back role. But as we've seen with Bayern's build-up, it's very flexible. He will very happily come inside and kind of be next to Pavlovic and Kimmich and interact with those. He'll also, he can play on the other side of the defence as well. So I think that's really useful for them. And there is that kind of recovery pace, athletic side to him as well. I think he's kind of holding it all together and giving Kompany more options when it comes to build-up, because it's exactly the kind of player you want to work with if you're a positional coach. You've got more solutions and more ways of kind of overloading different areas of the pitch, and Laimer can do a little bit of everything. And I think if we're looking at, as John mentioned, the Champions League and kind of having these solutions, I think Laimer's exactly the kind of player who gives you them in abundance.
Yeah, if we're talking about players actually giving options to teams, quick gear shift back home actually. Let's talk about Everton, because we have to talk about Jack Grealish. I mean, he's given Everton a great new option out on the wing. He's having a great season so far. Well, here's Sam Tai to tell us why.
Welcome to What's Changed, presented by BOYLE Sports. Jack Grealish has revived Everton's attack. The Toffees are flying high in the Premier League table and he is the catalyst. Let's take a look at what he's doing so well. Pick any attacking statistic and Grealish is top or near the top of it. Seriously. Assists, chances created, carries, you name it. And he scored his first goal for the club just before the international break. The Toffees are getting the ball to him on that left flank as often as possible. He's great at receiving an early pass and driving up the pitch. Also, he's been so dangerous from these areas, combining with Keane and Dewsbury Hall in the box and sending in crosses. Grealish has such gravity that opponents commit resources to stopping him, which opens up a constant 1v1 situation on the other side for Iliman Ndiaye, who has 3 league goals and is loving life right now. Signing Grealish was seen as a bit of a gamble by Everton, as they're paying plenty in wages to have him around, but he started like a rocket and he's transformed this team's attack.
Well, we talked about a lot of tactical diversity, and I mean, look, Vincent Kompany at Burnley versus Vincent Kompany at Bayern Munich. In the Premier League, people thought he was a bit of an idealist, but thriving at Munich.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a bit of an argument to say that he was a little bit dogmatic in the Premier League, but also you've got to remember the season before in the Championship, it was 101 points, 3 defeats in 46 games, dominated possession, territory, all the kind of things we're talking about with Bayern Munich. And I think, the main difference is that player quality and him having, as we said before with Konrad Laimer, the option to experiment with different things. I think, again, looking at the build-up, as we're looking at Manuel Neuer, obviously a lot more comfortable with his feet. He's able to kind of jump into the back three and overload the first line. We've got Laimer, again, drifting in and out of different areas. I think all of these things are giving him more tools and more kind of things to work with. And I mean, some people might use that as a kind of stick to beat him with. You can only perform with better players at your disposal, the same way people do about Pep Guardiola, for example. But I do think that, there is a skill into kind of keeping poorer teams afloat in divisions, to relegation candidates, keeping them going. But I also think there's a lot of skill and a lot of intelligence involved in taking teams like this to the next level. And I think that's what we've seen Vincent Kompany do, and for that you can only really give him praise. Yeah,
and I think it's also worth saying that the difference between Kompany at Burnley and Kompany at Bayern Munich is that he has a different coaching staff at his disposal, and maybe the argument could be made that he was a little bit too idealistic at Burnley. But I think what we have now is you have the good parts of Kompany, which is he's a former player with experience. He's won everything there is to win. He has the sort of aura in the dressing room to be able to get players to follow him and do the things that he wants them to do. But he's also married that with bringing in an assistant coach in René Maric, who is a really interesting character. He is someone who originally sort of came through writing for a German tactics blog, and they were the guys who were at the cutting edge of like tactical theory. And when you bring those two things together, I think you have the perfect marriage of what you need in a coaching staff to be able to get the most out of your players. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think a big part of the tactical diversity that we're seeing from Bayern is coming from the ability of the coaching staff to be able to bring it all through together.
Yeah, just like Maric, who knows? Maybe some football teams are watching you boys. Might be in the dugout soon, mate. All right, let's move on because, Bayern are brilliant and we know we've spoken about it, but, we have to kind of compare them to another team. It's in a similar sort of league system, I guess, which would be PSG, European champions. Any similarities there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we refer back to the Opta Power Rankings graphic that we used at the start of the show, you can see again that PSG, this dot here in the Ligue 1 section, they are huge outliers within their own division. They're allowed to, in the same way that Bayern Munich are, experiment a little bit, dominate games because of the higher player quality that they have, rotate as well. I think that's a really important thing. And I think it draws some interesting kind of comparisons to Enrique and Kompany, because it was Enrique's second season when we all kind of saw it click for Paris Saint-Germain. I think this style of football where it's positional, you need players to be in certain positions of the pitch to stretch your position, but it's also incredibly flexible and adaptable as well in terms of which players are dropping into those spaces. I think there was plenty of examples last season, but one that really sticks out to me was Aston Villa away. They kind of fell off a little bit in the second half, but in the first half there was João Neves, there was Vitinha, there was Fabian Ruiz dropping into spaces all over the pitch, opening up the midfield as we were speaking about with Bayern Munich, and really moving into those spaces with purpose and kind of incision further up the pitch.
Yeah, and I guess the other question is really about the league system. You've got Bayern, who are really dominating and have for many years the Bundesliga, and obviously PSG. I mean, Ligue 1. I mean, who's toppled them for ages?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting question, right? Because for so many years when PSG didn't win the Champions League, everyone used their dominance in the league as a stick to beat them with, right? They said maybe if there was a more competitive league, then they would have the sharpness going on into the later stages of the Champions League to be able to actually go deeper in that tournament. And, this is always what happens. It goes both ways, because I think you can make the same sorts of arguments about more competitive leagues at the top. For example, a Premier League side will be still competing in the Premier League later in the season when the knockout stages of the Champions League are on. Maybe they're less able to rotate, as we were talking about. I think that you bring all of that together, and it means that the Premier League sides have they have just so many more challenges of that nature to face as well. And we should mention that, for example, last season Ligue 1 were very I think flexible with the teams in European competitions. They would cancel and reschedule their fixtures when they had a big Champions League or Europa League game coming up, so they could rest their players and spend some more time training. And I think that was a smart idea by them, because essentially it's saying we want our teams in our league to go deeper in Europe because that will be good for our league in general. So again, Premier League sides don't really get that. So I think it's very much a case of, there's pros and cons to both approaches. But we've seen that it's worked for PSG in the past, and it probably could work for Bayern in the coming seasons as well. So that's another thing to keep our eye on.
Okay, so what we're saying, Bayern for the Champions League this season, gents. Come on, make a call.
You're not going to get me and Thom to commit to anything.
Come on, man. The viewers demand it.
So I guess in any sort of Champions League competition, any iteration of the Champions League, the favourites are going to be like 25% favourites, right? So you're talking 1 in 4. That's not something that I'm going to stake my house on, right? But I think that the big point that I hope we've made today is that you can match a lot of the things that Bayern have done with for example, the things that PSG have done. They've followed the meta. They're much more flexible in possession. They're using man-to-man principles out of possession. They're trying to reduce the danger of transitions. All of those things will make them much better, I think, in the Champions League. So for me, all you're going to get from me, Ayo, is that I'm going to say I would consider Bayern amongst the Champions League favourites, whereas I think maybe in previous seasons, maybe not.
Simple yes or no would have done that.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football.